Hello, welcome. All right, so get your names down. Thank you for attending. All right, so today we are covering the alleged causes of the Civil War. All right, so this one's pretty interesting, I think. All right, so are you guys doing okay?
Yeah, I'm doing fine. I'm
Yeah.
actually enjoying all these. I wasn't much of a history crazy when I was in school, so definitely enjoying going back through all this.
Oh, good, man. That does me well. I love hearing that. Yeah, it seems like a lot of people, including myself, that as you get a little older and mature, you grow in your appreciation for history. That's great. That's great. All right, and so hopefully Stephanie, you're doing well.
Yes, I am.
All right, good.
I have a quick question.
Yeah.
So I had emailed you, I think it was maybe like about a month ago, and I was just wondering if you ever got the chance to see that.
No, I'm so sorry. I'm terrible with my emails.
It's
Um,
okay.
no, did you so yeah, it's under your name. Is it your student email?
Yeah, it is.
Okay. Okay, I'll tell you what, I'm gonna play catch up on my emails. I'll put an asterisk by your name for email and
Okay, thank you.
I'll go straight for yours, okay?
Okay,
Sorry
thank you.
about that.
It's okay.
All right, so on this one, um, I just try to think of like different discourse, different types of debates and discussions that have been had on the Civil War. And I thought this one was worth putting here. Um, but the way I ask it, it's kind of a rhetorical question because I'm suggesting an answer, and that answer may or may not have merit. I'm sure there are scholars better versed in the Civil War than I who could probably refute me. But I went ahead and I thought, you know what, just be opinionated and just go with one direction or another. So I did, okay. And so, with number one is what I contend is that basically I'm saying that I'm suggesting that the Civil War likely could not have been averted diplomatically. All right. So on what basis? Well, I mean, the first thing you do normally in the whole inevitable thesis that the Civil War was inevitable is you go toward economic self-interest, right? That's what most historians go straight to, and you find that if we had used the textbook that I usually choose, Alan Brinkley in his American History a Survey, he does a good job at spending two chapters before the Civil War, one on the North, one on the South, and demonstrating how they went in two different economic and cultural paths. Okay. And so the economic part is you had the beginnings of what they call the first industrial revolution. The one that we're famous that we know more famously is the second one. That's when you take your 102 class and you have Carnegie and Rockefeller and the big robber barons and all that in the 1870s. That's usually the most famous one, but this is laying the foundation for it. So you have the beginning of interchangeable parts through also Eli Whitney with guns. So that as well as using the steam powered engine are going to be the origins of streamlined assembly line production, right? You look at Samuel Slater, these other people who came and tried to utilize these new inventions in the first mills, right, or early factories, and they were all in the North. They're almost all, matter of fact, in the New England states, in Connecticut, Rhode Island, Massachusetts, etc. And remember that from the beginning of the class, as many who came to the New England states and to New York, etc., were bourgeois. They were people from the cities of Europe, and so it'd been a tradition for them to try to be on the cutting edge of technology, to be commercially tied to one another, etc. And the whole alleged Protestant work ethic, okay, to get rich. And in the South, as you may recall, historians like Fisher contend that the demographic that primarily came into and settled the South were the gentrymen. And the gentry, they were nobility, and they were accustomed to having their wealth by people who worked for them. It was beneath them culturally to work with their hands. They were into the code of chivalry very, very strongly, and so that played a part in their justification of slavery, being like a father-like figure to these, quote, Sambo African Americans. And it also played a part in their strong military culture. And then also, I'm not sure that you could really tie it to the gentry class, but somewhere along the way, the South, through Jefferson and his Democratic Party, became libertarian. And so they didn't want outside interference outside their local areas. A lot of them fought with their own state governments, much less the federal government trying to put its nose into their business. So at any rate, you're going to have that phenomenon of Southerners who might be indifferent towards slavery, but to them, they had that libertarian principle that, hey, I don't care about slavery one way or another, but I do care who decides. And I think the state of Mississippi should decide, not Washington, D.C. These people have never been in our state. So libertarianism was strong in the South. And that also made them averse to paying taxes and engaging in bond drives. And the North was not so. The North had more sophisticated tax structures, got more tax revenue in. They sold bonds to the public, and the bond campaigns did very well, like in the 1820s when they established the Erie Canal. And so people were for government involvement in developing infrastructure, in subsidizing new industries. And so it was just more the Yankee way up in the North. And so they're going in two incompatible directions, someone might say. But then in addition to that is you have the parvenus in the Deep South. A parvenu is like a Beverly Hillbilly. It's someone who had never known wealth before and suddenly comes into great wealth. Nouveau riche, right? And usually both terms have a negative connotation. It implies that they don't have the proper sophistication, manners, courtesy, wisdom with their money, etc. That they'll likely just become very ostentatious and show off their new wealth. And then also that they will be adamantly stubborn and holding on to that newfound wealth because they know what it's like being poor. Well, after the War of 1812, there was a big land dash down into Mississippi and Alabama. And there was fraud involved, people selling land that didn't even existed or was already owned by somebody else. Lots of people took others to court. It was pretty messy, but it was definitely a bubble. Like lots of people got involved, lots of people wanted to get rich, etc. And so supposedly there developed a new class of planters who had not been associated at all with the gentry class of old, back from England. So they had not known money prior to this. They got great land deals. The land is very nitrogen rich, especially the Black Belt of Mississippi. And so very, very fertile. Then you had the short cotton strain that was kind of a hybrid that they made from the longer strain cotton. And supposedly it was more effectively cultivated and it was more lucrative for whatever reason I don't recall. You could make better money off the short strain. Then in addition to that, you had the invention of the cotton gin and the beginnings of its mass production. And the cotton gin mechanically extracted the seeds from the sticky cotton and saved you lots of hours of labor having slaves doing it by hand. And then in addition to that, sadly, you had a glut in the slave market. You had more slaves offered for sale than there were people who had an official demand for those slaves. So sadly, like any commodity, even though they're human beings, the price of slaves went down. So now slaves became more cheap, more affordable. And then also in the Upper South, in Maryland and Virginia, etc., they had and it was connected to all over the world. And I don't recall the details. I'm sorry, but the tobacco plantations started losing a lot of money in Virginia and Maryland. So much so that they started making money off of selling their slaves. And a lot of those slaves, we have music about it, songs that were written, plays that incorporate it from that time period, primary source materials that corroborate the information that there was a mass exodus of slaves from the Upper South down into this Deep South. And they were coming to these brand new planters who suddenly come into money. And then in addition to that, I don't know what happened with Flanders, present day Belgium, but something went awry with their cotton production. And we became the key clients to the British for their textiles, for their clothing factories. And so the things went so well suddenly by the 1850s. A Southern senator boasted that cotton is king. They were making so much money. At one given time, cotton production and sales constituted 2/3 of our gross national product, of the value of all things manufactured and sold in the country. So suddenly, these parvenus have a good thing going economically with these slaves down in the Deep South. And what do you know? They become the ones that by 1820 become known from their enemies, and they embraced the moniker of fire eaters. That basically they're uncompromising. They're almost fanatical in maintaining the rights of slave owners. So at any rate, you have the Missouri Compromise. And in the Missouri Compromise, you have Northern newspapers that when it was fixed, they contended, and they contended it in 1850 as well, with the Compromise of 1850. They called the Northern congressmen doe faces, DOE, like a baby deer. And it was basically saying that they were wimps, that they were cowering down to the fire eaters. And what do the fire eaters do? It becomes kind of an old mantra by the time Lincoln comes around. They threaten to secede. They threaten to leave the republic and go their own independent way as states if they didn't get their way and get the extension of slavery. And I think it's also safe to say that regardless of whether we follow the logic of it or not, it was taken as an absolute truth by many in the North, as well as many in the South, that the future of slavery, its existence, its success as an institution, almost completely rested upon its ability to spread into the West and create more states with slaves. So that's something to think about in the future. So at any rate, you have the Missouri Compromise, and they develop a line, right? The Missouri line is known as the 3630 line. And with that 3630 line, they contended that in the future, no slave states, because remember, we had bought the Louisiana Purchase. And as you probably know, we're going to take the Far West from Mexico in 1848. That's to come. Or actually, we just covered that. And so it was the idea of, okay, now in the future, nothing, the Northerners are trying to draw a line, saying, okay, fine. if you want Missouri to be a slave state as this new state coming into the Union from the Louisiana Territory, we'll allow it. We're going to allow Maine to break free from Massachusetts and become a free state. So the number of states and the number of senators, a pro-state, a pro-slave, and non-slave and free soil, as they call them, states will be equal still in the Senate. But they said in the future, nowhere above that 3630 line should it be allowed for these new future states to become pro-slavery. Well, that didn't hold. And so at any rate, on here, what I contend is, with the stubbornness of the fire eaters and their unwillingness to compromise on the issue, from their aggressiveness when you fast forward to the 1850 compromise and to the Kansas-Nebraska Act of 1854, you see that they would not take no for an answer. They wouldn't compromise. They absolutely insisted on keeping slavery alive in the West. And, you have different things that you could consider. Is, for one, you have the eminent domain law, right? We do that now for hospitals, freeways, elementary schools, etc., right? You say, this property you're on, it's of great societal value, so therefore you must sell it to the government. And we can do it at all levels, right? City governments can issue eminent domain, state governments can, and the federal. And you have to sell that property to the government. And you could take the government and the judiciary to court. And sometimes you could win it back and sometimes you won't. But at any rate, some people dabble with that idea of saying, okay, let's claim eminent domain over the slaves and make them sell us back their property, their chattel property, their movable property at property value, at market value. But no one really finished that thought out. I believe those who in the North who were entertaining that notion, for whatever reason, became disillusioned with that idea. So that never really happened. Okay. But notice also the difference between a territory and a state, because with the states, there is nothing in the Constitution that stated that the federal government could end slavery in the states. There just wasn't. Not until future amendments came about, namely the 13th. So before that, people said, hey, Mississippi, Alabama, they already exist as states. We can't touch them, including Abraham Lincoln, right? But with the territories, it might be different. And we're going to get to that soon. So at any rate, I'm going to contend that self-interest of the South, also their desire to keep factional allies. Remember, a faction is a group that shares the same self-interest. So the idea is, if you are growing cotton with slave labor, it doesn't matter if you are in Virginia, Alabama, or all the way over here in New Mexico in the West, that chances are you're going to vote the same way, because what is in one planter's best interest is in the others, right? So that was also on their mind. We know that from the Wilmot Proviso. During the Mexican-American War, a guy named David Wilmot made a proposal that in all the states that we're about to take from Mexico, because it was becoming clear we were going to win the war, that we should prohibit slavery in them right now, right off the bat. And there were fistfights, there were arguments, it was very contested. But what's interesting is there wasn't a whole lot of talk about the rights of slaves, the humanity of slaves. It was a lot more superficial and political. It was about the right to property. It was about our federal structure and what the federal government can and cannot do. And then there were some concessions from people that we know they thought that way, is that they needed allies in the West to vote their same way. So it worked both ways. Not only the slave faction, but the bourgeois leaders in the North, right? They were promising their through the Whig Party, and then in 1854, the brand new Republican Party, they were promising jobs to their voters. We're like, hey, we're for free labor. We want factory jobs that people can earn wages in. They could climb up the ladder, the corporate ladder, and chase after that American dream. And so some of them went so far as to saying, we don't want any, quote, Negroes in any of the Western states either. We don't want the jobs to go to those, quote, Negroes. We want them to be free jobs on free soil given to white men. So yes, you could oppose slavery for all the wrong reasons and just want white labor only. And matter of fact, those who leaned that way were known as free soilers. Very racist, but for just what they said is that there's no, first of all, slavery gives a black man a job that a white man should have. So they said, even in the South, right? Even if they don't have factories, then they should be sharecropping. They should be renting that land to poor white Southern men and allowing them to farm their farms instead of these, quote, black slaves. And so at any rate, they thought that slavery does not induce people to work because they have no remuneration. They get no reward for their labor. So why should they work hard? So they said there should be jobs that provide incentives, a chance to rise up, chance to get raises and to get decent wages, etc. That will get the best out of America's workers. So a lot of people said that slavery was inefficient. It was obsolete economically. And some of them were just that callous, not caring about the humanity of the slaves, but just on those grounds alone were against slavery. So you had all kinds of motives and different demographics of people with their different motives, opposing and supporting the spreading of slavery. So with that, as you'll see, like you see there, they're criticized them as dough faces. I kind of blame the Southern reps and contend that they would not have gone for any of this. They wouldn't have accepted eminent domain. They would not have accepted the failure of slavery to spread to the West so that they could gain factional allies. And so therefore, I don't think the Civil War could have been avoided diplomatically. I don't know how strong of a thesis that is, but anyway, that's what I went with. And then you see in 1853 and 1854, they said, okay, Kansas and Nebraska, right? You see them on that map right there. Kansas and Nebraska. What do we do with these areas, right? Well, Kansas and Nebraska were both above the 3630 line that you see Missouri next to Kansas, the bottom of the line in Missouri. They said nothing below that. Or I'm sorry, nothing above that line geographically should allow slavery in the future, according to the 1820 Compromise. Well, they broke that 3630 line. They said, what we're going to do, a guy named Stephen Douglas had the day at that time and was voted successfully as senator of Illinois against and defeating Abraham Lincoln. And he said, let's let the people in the states decide for themselves. So the democratic solution, right? Have a referendum, have an open vote, and let the people in that region decide for themselves. What's more American than that? Stephen Douglas said. So at any rate, they had elections in Kansas, a referendum. Both sides contended that the other side cheated and that they won. Both sides refused to step down as the rightful government, and thus ensued a civil war in Kansas. And it was known as the Bleeding Kansas episode. The president, Franklin Pierce, wanted nothing to do with it. He could have stepped in some way or another, but he didn't. He not only was kind of indifferent about slavery, but he had a train catastrophe happen, and his son died, and he was in mourning. So he just stayed in the background, and he let events take their toll. Well, he finishes out while they're still fighting in Kansas, and it falls into the lap of Buchanan. And Buchanan is a Yankee, but he feels like he must placate the South. So he contends that the pro-South side at Lecompton, Kansas, is the true winner, and that the Free Soilers at Topeka need to step down and acknowledge the rightful winners, and that slavery is permitted in Kansas, and it stays that way through the Civil War. And then going a few years backward, 1850, the compromise was California becomes a new free state, but now something's got to be given to the South, right? Because now you have one more free state than slave states. And so they put in a strict fugitive slave law. And in Syracuse, New York, there was a black man, and he was at a black church, and he was surrounded by a posse all the way from the South who came all the way to New York to find him. And when they came out of the church, his fellow parishioners circled around him to protect him. And it started a big riot, and people were killed. And then 3 northern states. And what's funny to me is the 3 northern states that chose, I can't remember the exact 3, but they are very lukewarm in their anti-slavery credentials. So that, like, when they had new party Republicans run for office saying that we're for free labor, anti-slavery, no more spreading of slavery to the West, they didn't get elected. Most of them did not get elected in these 3 states. You had abolitionists who were making speeches against slavery and were being attacked. And in, I think, one of the 3 states that we're talking about, because this happened in several northern states, is they took away First Amendment rights from the abolitionists and said that you are provoking violence with your words against slavery. I kid you not. They revoked their First Amendment. Nevertheless, these 3 lukewarm northern states issued liberty laws saying that they will not abide by the fugitive slave law. They will not cooperate with any Southern, leaders, vigilante groups, etc., militia. Usually it was members of their state militias that would go on regular reconnaissance tours to look for runaways, rebellions, etc., and known as slave patrol. So at any rate, they said no, Southerners stay out of our state. So I find that to be interesting too, that you didn't have to be like an ardent abolitionist against slavery, and you could still get the feeling that the Southerners were throwing their weight around, and now they were becoming invasive to the North, like getting involved in their business, their state's business. So at any rate, yeah. So court history. this is what we learned as kids, right? So the North basically, in the midst of its first industrial revolution, has this response that is interesting. Some people go to Maslow's hierarchy of needs and saying that they were becoming so economically comfortable in the North that they could look to their next higher level of self-realization and actualization, and like look into improving society, etc. Some people think that they were looking for answers because the world was industrializing so quickly, and that it was becoming unrecognizable to them. So they were turning to religion and reforms, etc., kind of for answers, for a sense of security psychologically, a sense of belonging. I don't know what it is, but it is interesting that in the 1830s, in the beginning of the antebellum, just before the war, is all antebellum means, in the 1830s and 40s and 50s, you get the development of lots of different reform and protest and just improvement societies. Okay, so for instance, you had the Transcendentalists. The Transcendentalists I like to call intellectual hippies. They took from Native American pantheism, they took from Buddhism, Hinduism. At any rate, they contended that all human beings need to transcend their material life. That I think of like John Lennon, right? His song, "I'm just sitting here watching the wheels go round and round." Like people just having their spouse, 2.5 kids, house with a white picket fence, work from 9 to 5. Is there more to life than that? And just wait to die? So the Transcendentalists were like, no, there's much more. Is you need to transcend that realm, and you need to find your unique purpose for having been born. And so it kind of reminds me later of like the beatniks in the 1950s. And so each person's answer to that is likely to be different, they thought. And the best way to do that is through traveling and experiencing the world. It's through empirical experience, so going out and doing things. Okay. It's through philosophical musing and reading of books. And it's through quiet solitude and meditation that you could transcend your material lifestyle and find what's deeper for you. And the thing is, for them, right, all human beings, they thought we were all connected by an oversoul, as they called it, this great pantheistic spirit uniting us all. And so that no one was any more important than anybody else. So black, white, male, female, old, young, poor, rich, no differences. Okay. And so they started these utopian movements where they were literally trying to help people, attend or experience this liberation of their soul and of their mind. And they had it down to a science. You'd have so many hours of manual labor they thought was good for you, so many hours of exercise, watch your diet, so much time of book learning, so much time of solitude, so much time of altruistic acts or like charitable acts and helping out others and cooperating with them. And they had it down to every little detail, even their sex life. And so at any rate, it was interesting. The two most famous were Oneida in New York and New Harmony in Indiana. So then in addition to the Transcendentalists, you had all the reformers. Reformers were they were for prison reform. Dorothy Dix was for institutional reform for the psychiatrically, suffering. So back then, of course, we wouldn't call it now, but she created the first, quote, insane asylums, as we would definitely not call them that today. You have the pro public school with Horace Mann trying to spread it to all the states, and they fought over the type of curriculum to have for the kids. You had the beginnings of colleges that were inclusive of women and of African Americans, like Oberlin, Oberlin College in Ohio. And so you had the beginnings of college educated, African Americans and college educated women. You had those who were against alcohol, known as the temperance movement. So technically temperance means drink with, what's Aristotle's word? Moderation. But they were big at this time. You had vice squads develop in northern cities against prostitution, theft, murder, violence, etc. And so notice it's kind of crazy, right? That all of this is just suddenly coming into the fore in the 1830s. Okay, so is this suddenly now a unique generation? All right. And then you have the women's rights movement that you saw some of on that assignment with Jackson, the second one to it. And then you also had the abolitionists. And the abolitionists, why did they have their own name? Why were they so radical in the eyes of their contemporaries? Is, for one, is they had no constitutional qualms at all. They didn't care if there's nothing in the Constitution that states that the federal government can end slavery in the states. They want it done. They were for nonviolent civil disobedience, right? The notion that there are natural laws, and those natural laws include treating with humanity all people, including African Americans. And so hence, if that natural law, that stands above man-made laws. And the man-made laws, the civic laws, sometimes man gets them right, sometimes he doesn't. Well, to the abolitionists, he certainly didn't get it right with slavery. So in violation of this man-made law, you were standing for the higher one, right? For the golden rule of treating others as you'd have them treat you. So at any rate, they were for, civil disobedience. They didn't care about the Constitution and what it did or did not say. They also did not oppose slavery because they thought it was economically, inefficient or obsolete, as some people were saying. They said it because they used very religious terms. They said that slavery is immoral, it's a sin, it's evil. And then also they stressed the humanity of the slaves. So think of this also, though, is for one, you could feel sorry for slaves and believe on principle that it's wrong to treat human beings like that. And you could have them have slavery ended and do nothing else. Some were just there, right? Then the next phase is you could say, okay, I believe that we not only need to free them, but I think we need to give them basic economic rights. The right to receive remuneration for their pay, and the right to buy, rent, borrow, etc., right? And to basically live economically. That was a second group. Then third was, we need to give them basic political protections, right? They could sue people in court. They're entitled to the basics of the Bill of Rights, etc., right? Then the next phase is suffrage. I think they have a right of full political participation, whereby they can vote, they could run for office, etc. Right? So that was even more of a radical step. And then lastly, on the very end, I might say, are the ones who said, I would let my white daughter marry a black man. I am for social and cultural integration between us. Well, the abolitionists were all the way to full political participation, some even the last step for genuine social integration. All right, so they were seen as radicals. So they made a lot of noise disproportionate to their numbers. How did they do that? The spoken and the written word. The written word, you had the beginnings of the cylindrical rotary press, the steam-powered press, and now it's the beginnings of the newspapers that cost a penny, the penny press. And so people are reading what they're having to say and write. Okay. Then secondly were the lyceums, Lyceum. A lyceum was begun by Aristotle back in Greece, and it's an intellectual fair. And they spread out, they became in vogue in the North, whereby you would come, especially if you didn't have access to a college education, this is the next best thing. You pay a small fee to get into the fair, and you have one professor and expert from one field after another come up and give lectures for you to listen to. Well, the abolitionists paid money to be in those lyceums. And so you had, Frederick Douglass, who was just an incredible orator, had incredible stories, sad stories about his youth before he ran away as a slave. And he had people in tears listening to him. So they made a lot of noise disproportionate to their numbers. All right. And then in addition to that, you have leading radical Republicans. Radical Republicans they were called radical by their own Republicans who thought they were way too far. Is they kind of were abolitionist politicians, because most of the abolitionists were not politicians. They wanted to use moral persuasion to win the country over. But some of these guys, they brought that zeal, that same abolitionist zeal, into the White House, into Capitol Hill, the Congress. So Salmon Chase, this guy did a program throughout the South as a Northern Republican, trying to convince white Southerners that black slavery was hurting them, taking jobs away from them, etc. The Northerners or the Southerners were furious. They hated Salmon Chase. He got death threats, etc. They said he was trying to provoke a class war between the planters and the poor white Southerners. Benjamin Wade, Joshua Giddings. Joshua Giddings was a bunkmate with Lincoln, and Lincoln contends that Joshua Giddings had a strong effect on his movement toward being a better abolitionist, or becoming something approximating an abolitionist. All right. So what did they start doing? They started playing the game that the Democrats had done, the fire eaters. They told the moderate Republicans, hey, you want those import tariffs for your industries because you're pro big business? Okay. You want the subsidies to the new industries? All right. We're not voting with you unless you vote stronger against slavery. So they started making ultimatums in Congress and being more confrontational with the South. So at any rate, Then in addition to that were the events of the 1850s. And I'm going to put a word here. Polarizing, right? Like with magnets. These events were of such a state, there was of such a nature that they almost forced you to pick a side during the 1850s. So I've named a few of them. Okay, the fugitive slave law, and 3 northern states said, nope, we're not abiding by it. Right. The Bleeding Kansas episode. People started coming from north and south to go and fight in that civil war in Kansas in 1854. More and more abolitionists began to get lynched. That got the country's attention. Then in addition to that, you had the Dred Scott case. And with the Dred Scott case, the Southerners of the Supreme Court really laid it down heavily. Is they said that a black man has no place being a citizen in any state, should never be able to represent himself in court, and that the federal government must protect the Fifth Amendment to property of all its citizens, including their chattel property, their slaves, wherever they move. Think about that, wherever they move. So if they move into a free state in the north, they have to abide by that. And they have to allow to bring their, okay, what if just more and more bring slaves up into the northern states? The federal government has to protect those slaves as their property. So, you know, it may not have been hyperbole. It may not have been, you know, strategic exaggeration when Lincoln said they're trying to bring slavery back over the whole Union with this Dred Scott decision. Then you also had the Underground Railroad, Harriet Tubman, and like 19 trips into the South. Southerners were furious. She was going and shaking hands with Republicans in Congress, and they wanted her, you know, they wanted her executed for fomenting rebellion amongst the slaves. Then you had Uncle Tom's Cabin, and Uncle Tom is a slave that's modeled after Jesus Christ. Super loving, super docile, super loyal. And he ends up taking credit for an act of rebellion that he didn't even do just to protect another slave. And he gets killed for it at the end. And he tells the foreman who's killing him, the overseer, the cruel overseer, that he forgives him as he's killing him. Abraham Lincoln met her, shook her hands, and said, so you're the little lady who started this war. So I don't know how much truth there is to that, but he sure thought so. And then, of course, you had John Brown's invasion of the South. He came down with only 21 men in Virginia at Harper's Ferry, killed the guards, took the guns, and began to disseminate them out to the slaves to start a mass slave rebellion. Well, it failed. He had, you know, probably the most attuned to trial in 19th century American history, and he was executed for treason against the state of Virginia. So you have a cultural revolution in the North. They force discourse on slavery as a humanitarian issue, right? Despite their small numbers. Then events spiral out of control in the 1850s that have a polarizing effect of putting people into one camp or another. And then lastly, according to court history, Abraham Lincoln finally comes around. So note, court history of Abraham Lincoln does not depict him like Salmon Chase, like Charles Sumner, and these other great abolitionists up in the North. He had to take time to come around. Even as court historians agree with that. Then number 3 says this was not a moral crusade. This is revisionist history. This contains some of the stuff I've already mentioned. Free soilers were against slavery for all the wrong reasons. A lot in the South were for the South not to fight for slavery, but to fight for their own states' rights to decide on the issue of slavery, like from the book Life of Johnny Reb. That should have it here somewhere. Look at this. Only 5 of 19 northern states had given some citizenship rights to some African American men by the time of the Civil War. Historians estimate that abolitionists and radical Republicans constituted about 2.5% of the population, and many, like Elijah Lovejoy, were murdered by angry, racist northern mobs. In the draft riots of 1863, New York mobs attacked Black orphanages and African Americans, chanting they would not die for the N-words when the North started drafting them. So they clearly weren't fighting a crusade. Then in the North, there was a declaration. Was it the Crittenden Resolution? Oh, shame on me for not remembering. But there was a resolution in the North right away at the beginning of the war, saying this war is not being fought over slavery. That it is fought to preserve the Union, to keep the 11 states of the South from leaving. And Congress passed that. Then Abraham Lincoln, in his first inaugural speech, promised the South that he did not have the constitutional authority nor the personal inclination to interfere with the institution of slavery where it already exists in the states. Horace Greeley asked him what his number 1 priority was. He was the biggest journalist, arguably, of the time. And he said, my paramount object in this struggle is to save the Union. It is not either to save or destroy slavery. Yikes. In his Emancipation Proclamation, he declared free the slaves of rebels only. So people in Kentucky, people in West Virginia, they could fight with and for the Union and keep their slaves in return for their loyalty on the battlefield. And then Lincoln, look at here, stated, I will say then that I am not, nor ever have been, in favor of bringing about in any way the social and political equality of the white and black races. When they first started taking slaves away, when they would win on the battlefield, they called them confiscation acts, that we were punishing them for their treason by confiscating their property. And Benjamin Butler was one of the first ones who had thousands of slaves that he freed, and he treated them like dirt, made them bury the dead, dig the latrines to go to the bathroom in, complained about them, having to feed them and deal with them. and they would have these contraband camps, as they were called, of runaway slaves or freed slaves. When they finally enlisted black soldiers to fight, you've seen that old movie Glory, like the 54th Regiment. White soldiers were paid $13 a month. African American slaves were paid $10. But look at this. As casualties mounted, Army morale diminished, and the outcome of the war remained precarious. They didn't know if they could win or not. States Howard Zinn, emancipating the slaves began to appear useful to the federal government in dividing and terrifying the South, and garnering support from the radical Republicans, and enhancing the resources of the Union Army, and in justifying the carnage with a newfound purpose or crusade. According to historian James McPherson, abolitionist Senator George Julian, after failing to appeal to the hearts of his peers in freeing the slaves, appealed to their self-interest in claiming that freeing and arming the Negro would terrify the South and tip the odds in the North's favor on the battlefield. Secretary of Navy Gideon Welles said freeing and arming the black men was a military necessity. So there is a lot of indicting stuff as well, as much as I love to read and write about court history. So at the end there, right, this war was not a crusade. And then Lincoln and his alleged evolution. This one's twofold. It's pretty simple. Is there were two things that held back Abraham Lincoln from being anything that even approximated an abolitionist. One was indifference, emotionally and mentally. And secondly, was his high estimation for the Constitution, feeling like he couldn't do that with a Constitution. So one barrier was overcome at a time. In 1838 and in 1841, he took a trip down the Mississippi and he saw slaves in chains for the first time. Said he had a hard time sleeping. Said that one of them was cutting capers, like playing the clown for the other slaves. And he was just flabbergasted by that, how he could even pretend to be happy in such miserable circumstances. And then also he saw a young, attractive black girl who was being kind of catcalled and like sexually harassed as she was up on the platform, and they were bidding to purchase her as a slave. He supposedly bought her and immediately set her free to save her from the other men. So at any rate, he suddenly develops a conscience, and he starts writing stuff like this. If A can prove, however conclusively, that he may have enslaved B, why can't B say the same thing and enslave A? Oh, you say A is white and B is black. It's color then, the lighter having the right to enslave the darker? It says, take care, by this rule, you are to become the slave to the first man that you meet with fairer skin than your own. You don't mean color exactly. You mean whites are intellectually superior to the blacks, and therefore have the right to enslave them. Take care again. By this rule, you're to become the slave to the first man that you meet with an intellect superior to your own. So he had a way of taking the rationale of the South in support of slavery and almost sarcastically turning it on its head. So then he begins defending abolitionists with their First Amendment rights. And then after that, he goes into the House and he has Joshua Giddings as a roommate. And Giddings is telling him that, hey, we need to make symbolic efforts, and we need to make sure that slavery can't progress anymore further to the west, and its days will be numbered. And so Lincoln, his very first thing he does, he declares, he puts forth a proposition to end slavery in Washington, D.C., because D.C. is under its own jurisdiction, right? And it's supposed to be a symbol that slavery's days are numbered. So he did do that. So it's like he's slowly coming around, right? So then he, the next big one, right, is he notices, it's after the Dred Scott case. And he becomes convinced after the Dred Scott case that the South is the proverbial bully, that between the fire eaters in Congress and Taney and the guys in the Supreme Court who are Southerners, trying to contend that you have to recognize people slaves no matter what state they move to. He said, we have to get more aggressive. And so that supposedly helped him get over his constitutional misgivings. So what he does, he looks at something very simple, is the Northwest Ordinances. During our Confederation, Thomas Jefferson mapped out the Ohio Valley, present-day Wisconsin, Minnesota, Indiana, Illinois, Ohio, but they weren't states yet, right? Remember, it was just all territory and around the Great Lakes. And he said, but he made an edict that in the future, whatever states they become, slavery is to be prohibited. So he said, there it is. That is our indicator that the founding fathers wanted slavery's days to be numbered. And that is our precedent for forbidding slavery in territories, because they're not states yet. So he runs for senator at this time. And it's like he loses the battle, but he wins the war. He takes a bold stand for the first time, running for Senate against Stephen Douglas, the guy who said, let the people vote themselves over slavery. Stephen Douglas puts his back to the wall. He knows the audience, the type of audience that's listening. And he says, so you're telling me, Mr. Lincoln, that if every single person, every single inhabitant in Kansas voted for slavery, just you, unilaterally would say no to them because you think that slavery is morally wrong? And Abraham Lincoln stood his ground and said, yes, I would. He said, firstly, we have a republic and not a democracy, which is true. He says, we don't need to decide this issue democratically. And then he said, secondly, our founding fathers prohibited slavery in territory. And so why should I feel afraid to do anything different? So hence, at that time, from that debate forward, by the way, he lost for Senate because he had a lot of kind of libertarian people that were from the South just one generation before that or two generations before that who had moved to Illinois. So he lost in the short run, but he gained respect from a lot of people up in the North for standing his ground. And so that's exactly what he does. He said when he runs in 1860, he says, if I win, slavery is not going anywhere else. It's not moving anywhere else to any other territory. And then his deal with Kansas, he contends that he contended that he needed Kentucky, right? That he needed Kentucky. So he told them that they could keep their slaves, but he told Stanton in his cabinet, he says, they can keep them for now. They don't realize it, but they're not keeping them permanently. He says, the moment I no longer need their military help, I'm going to make them get rid of their slaves as well. They just don't know it yet. So he was very shrewd that way, and contending that he was kind of playing like a chess player to use Kansas until he no longer needed their help. And then by the time he died, New Orleans, they were setting forth the new Yankee government that had controlled Louisiana and won it back over to the Union. They had a state convention and they were writing their own new state constitution to be re-annexed back into the Union. And he made in his last speech the appeal to allow, he said, at least the better sort, whatever that meant. A lot of people think it was those who were educated and those who had served in the army, the better sort of Negro men to participate in the government. And then his killer, John Wilkes Booth, said, voting for inwards, that man just gave his last speech. And then if you see this quote right here, he sounds like an abolitionist. He's saying basically that the Civil War is God's wrath on the country. It's God's spanking of the country for the sin of slavery. So by the time he died, he sounded at least a little bit like an abolitionist. Like he had finally come around. It's known as the Mighty Scourge Address. All right, so you guys have any questions? I didn't bore you to sleep, did I? All right, well, I'm going to let you guys go then, okay? You guys take care. You as well, Calvin. Thank you. See you later.